not voted should know that it has started. Senator Young is next, but then after him is Senator Murphy. I've asked Senator Murphy to preside until the chair can return. Thank you.
Welcome, Ms. Tracy. Good to have you here. Earlier this year, my Senate colleagues and I introduced legislation to sanction Chinese financial institutions that conduct transactions with any Russian financial institutions trying to avert sanctions by using China's alternative to SWIFT. The end goal of this legislation was to encourage Beijing to consider the costs of siding with Putin in his barbaric attack on Ukraine. From your perspective, can you expand on how actions like this from the international community have prompted Putin's allies and friends of convenience to rethink their relationships with Moscow?
Senator, thank you. I think that the kinds of conversations that the administration and our partners and allies in Europe and elsewhere have been having with not just government officials in the PRC, but also the private sector have had an effect. I think there is a very clear understanding that evading these sanctions, crossing these sanctions, will bring consequences. That is my understanding based on the conversations that have taken place thus far. But I think that we're going to have to remain vigilant, and I think if I'm taking that point from you, It is the importance of vigilance here.
So in the spirit of vigilance, have you seen, and maybe could you point to some changes that have occurred in the Russia-Chinese bilateral relationship, positive or negative, since we took this action?
One very telling episode to me was what happened in Tashkent earlier this year. This was in the fall, I believe. It was a gathering. President Xi was there. There were other leaders from the region there, and certainly President Putin looked very uncomfortable. I mean, this has been well noted in the press, and he had to acknowledge that after that initial announcement back during the Olympics of the No Limits partnership, that his Chinese colleague was expressing some concern and had questions, and the fact that he had to say that publicly was a pretty big deal. We saw some other interactions at that particular conference that I think again showed that that some of Russia's partners were and are uneasy with the course that Russia's been taking.
Yeah, thank you. So as the months have lingered on since that point, Vladimir Putin has found himself on his back foot, to put it charitably, and he's been increasingly desperate, it seems, and Moscow has signaled from time to time that it's willing to respond asymmetrically to the West in various ways. Where do you assess our interests are most vulnerable to these Russian acts of asymmetric retaliation?
Senator, in terms of the asymmetrical behavior, some of it is falling on our mission operations, something that was touched on earlier. I think that we also see Russia projecting a very pernicious and malign influence in places like Africa, where we don't always have an easy answer. And in this case, I'm thinking of groups like the Wagner Company, who are really, as I said, a pernicious influence that is destabilizing good governance efforts, the fueling corruption in some of its activities. So these are at least
Gray
two
zone
examples.
warfare, as it were,
Yes.
right? Yeah. And before I return, yield to back to the chairman, just with respect to that discrete threat, do you have any thoughts about how we best safeguard ourselves and work with our allies to safeguard them against these actions?
Senator, this is where I think we need just to maintain some very tight coordination. We need to be talking very, very frankly and candidly with our allies, and we need to do things in unison. I think this is certainly something I've seen across my career, that when we act with partners and allies on some of these tough transnational issues or gray zone issues, that we're in a much better place. But I think it is, there's a lot happening right now, and so that we don't lose sight of some of these places that maybe aren't on the European continent, but actually have a nexus to what Russia's doing in Ukraine.
Thank you, Ms. Tracy. Chairman?
I'm recognizing myself under Senator Menendez's instructions and then going to Senator Risch. Good to see you. Thank you.